Hey nerds, just Jamie here with
your friend Claude.
And this is NERDBomber versus Movies, the show where two movies fight and we pick a winner. Two things I always like to mention. One, we have a rubric. We don't just pull these scores out of thin air. We have some rules. Two, we don't watch the movies on the show. That's too expensive. We encourage you to go find them. Let us know what you think. All right, today's matchup is in honor of the recent release and immediate success of Top Gun Maverick. We have the original Top Gun from 1986 facing off against 1990's Days of Thunder. The connections between these two movies are kind of obvious. In both films, we have Tom Cruise playing cocky protagonists operating expensive machinery while being directed by Tony Scott. But let's get into some specifics. First up, we have Top Gun, as I mentioned, from 1986. The writers are the team of Jim Cash and Jack Epps Jr. You know them from Legal Eagles, Dick Tracy, Turner and Hooch, Anaconda. It's all based on an article by Ehud Yonah in California Magazine. It was first published in 1983. It was about two pilots named Yogi and Possum and how they navigated the Top Gun class in the Navy. The director is Tony Scott, R.I.P. You know him from Beverly Hills Cop 2, The Last Boy Scout, Crimson Tide, Days of Thunder. And the producers are Don Simpson and Jerry Bruckheimer, who you know from Flashdance, Beverly Hills Cop, The Rock, Bad Boys, and they continue to put out a lot of movies now. The music was done by Harold Faltermeyer. He's also known for Beverly Hills Cop, as well as the Flesh movies. And don't forget Kenny Loggins with the iconic Danger Zone on the soundtrack. Good cast here. We have Tom Cruise playing Maverick Pete Mitchell. Don't think I have to mention his filmography. Kelly McGillis plays Charlie, Charlotte Blackwood. You know her from The Witness and The Accused. Val Kilmer plays Iceman Tom Kazansky. You know him from Batman Forever, Tombstone, and The Saint. Anthony Edwards plays Goose Nick Bradshaw. You know him from ER, the TV show. Tom Skerritt plays Viper Mike Metcalf. You know him from Alien, Contact, the Picket Fences TV show. Michael Ironside plays Jester Rick Heatherly. You might know him from Scanners, Total Recall, and Starship Troopers, that is. Meg Ryan plays Carol Goose's wife. She did a lot of romantic comedies in the 80s and 90s, like When Harry Met Sally, Sleepless in Seattle, You've Got Mail, and others. And James Tolkan plays Stinger Tom Jardian. Most of us know him as Mr. Strickland from the Back to the Future movies. Also look for Clarence Gilliard, Rick Rossovich, Tim Robbins, and Adrian Pastar making appearances as various pilots. In terms of the production, as a military movie depicting United States military operations, the Pentagon did have approval over the way certain things were represented, and they made a little bit of money doing it, as well as you can't overlook the recruiting potential from something like this. Many aircraft carrier shots were done aboard the USS Enterprise, and NASA astronaut Scott Altman deserves some recognition because he was the guy in the pilot seat during the tower flyby scenes when Maverick's buzzing the tower. Film cameras were mounted inside and outside fighter jets. This was a challenge, but ultimately it worked. And speaking of the military, actually Matthew Modine was up for the part of Pete Mitchell, but he stepped away because he didn't agree with some of the pro-military messaging of the film. Also, don't worry, the fabled MiG-28 Soviet jets don't exist, and they never did. So take a deep breath, everybody. All right. In terms of pop culture footprint, it was hugely popular box office. It was a hugely popular box office hit in its time. There were video games from all the way back to the NES, all the way up to the PS3. There were toys, there were novelizations, there were comics, and now we have the sequel that I mentioned before coming up only 36 years later. All right, next up, Days of Thunder, 1990. The writers were Robert Towne, known for Mission Impossible 1 and 2, as well as Chinatown, based on a story by Towne and Cruise. The director, again, Tony Scott, with all of the same credentials he had before. And the producers were once again Don Simpson and Jerry Bruckheimer, who did all the same movies I already mentioned as well.
And Don Simpson in a cameo.
That's right, yeah. Don Simpson does show up on screen. Hans Zimmer does the music. You know him from most of the Christopher Nolan films, as well as Gladiator and others. Again, the cast, we have Tom Cruise as Cole Trickle, the race car driver. Robert Duvall plays Harry Hogg, Cole's crew chief. We know him from Goodfellas and, of course, The Sixth Day. That's been on the show before. Randy Quaid plays Tim Dalland, Cole's team owner. You know him from the Vacation movies and Independence Day. Nicole Kidman plays Dr. Claire Lewicki, Cole's doctor. You know her from the others, Batman Forever. Cruise and Kidman met on this movie, and they would go on to make Far and Away and Eyes Wide Shut together, as well as getting married, which is kind of an important moment in most people's lives. Michael Rooker plays Rowdy Burns. He's Cole's rival. You know Rowdy Burns mostly now as Yondu from the MCU. John C. Reilly plays Buck Bretherton. Of course, John C. Reilly would go on to star in Talladega Nights, The Ballad of Ricky Bobby, which is very much a send-up of this film. Cary Elwes, Cole's potential replacement in the movie, plays Russ Wheeler. He would go on to do Hot Shots, which of course is a send-up of Top Gun. And don't forget Fred Thompson playing Big John, who is patterned after NASCAR's president, Bill France. There's a lot of personalities from NASCAR making appearances. You got Rusty Wallace, Harry Gant, Jerry Punch, Neil Bonnet, and the king himself, Richard Petty, all doing cameos. In terms of the production here, the racing footage was a combination of footage from actual races. There was some stunt driving involved, and actual NASCAR races that included cars with the same paint schemes as the cars in the movie. These were provided by Hendrick Motorsports, and they were driven in various races by a combination of Greg Sachs, Tommy Ellis, Bobby Hamilton, and Hut Strickland, and they didn't win anything, unfortunately. The events of the movie are fiction, but they're loosely based on various events that happened during the careers, specifically of NASCAR drivers Tim Richmond and Jeff Bodine. And there are some others as well. The legacy of this movie, pop culture footprint, it did well at the box office. It did spawn a nice kind of presence in its day. There were toys, there were various video games starting with the NES, as well as various incarnation of the franchise in games up to the Xbox 360 and PS3. And of course, 16 years later, as I mentioned, we'd have Talladega Nights, The Ballad of Ricky Bobby, which was an obvious satire of this movie, among some other things. Ultimately, the movie doesn't have much of a current footprint, but it was a success in its time and a little bit beyond, so it should be recognized for that. I think that's it for the basics. In just a second, Claude will be back with the big board.
All right, here I am, as promised, along with this fairly sizable board, also as promised, to bring you tonight's Tale of the Tape. And as you may or may not have noticed, I'm flying solo in true Maverick fashion, due to a technical difficulty or two. But that said, let's go up to the distributing studio where we always start and kick things off. And it's Paramount Pictures for both movies. And perhaps that's not a surprise given that they're both Tom Cruise vehicles produced under Jerry Bruckheimer and Don Simpson, who, starting with Flashdance in 1983, signed a deal with Paramount to produce several pictures for them, and this is part of that agreement. Moving down to the ratings, PG, perhaps a bit surprising for Top Gun, and PG-13 for Days of Thunder. And I say perhaps a bit surprising because of the steaminess of the "You Take My Breath Away" love scene between Tom Cruise and Kelly McGillis in that movie. However, it's edged out ever so slightly in Days of Thunder because in that love scene, you get a glimpse of Nicole Kidman's body. And that's just how American ratings go. Moving down to running time, they are damn near identical. 110 minutes for Top Gun and 108 minutes for Days of Thunder. But I will note that to me, when I watch these films, Top Gun, even though it's technically a longer movie, it feels a decent amount faster to me. And I don't know if that's due to the nature of the extended amounts of dramatic and tonally serious storytelling in Days of Thunder, and or the kind of brisk pace that Top Gun keeps, and perhaps none of the above or all of the above, but those are my perceptions watching the two. Going down to the release dates, May 16th, 1986 for Top Gun, and June 27th, 1990 for Days of Thunder. I think it's safe to consider both of these summer blockbusters. Top Gun is kind of more interesting in that while it didn't, start the summer blockbuster or invent it by any stretch of the imagination, it is easy to trace back how summer blockbusters and kind of big movies like this in general are packaged and promoted today. And it's also worth mentioning that whether or not it's exactly true, pop culturally, people consider Top Gun to be the first home video release that was affordably priced. Up until that point, VHS cassettes were sold to the public at the rental or dealer price of around $90 each, and Top Gun is the first that people point to come out at a price point of $29.99, thus making it viable for people to own and watch movies at home from that point forward. So, it gets even more interesting though when we look at the budgets for the movies. Top Gun was made for a seemingly scant amount of $15 million. It seemed small even back then, especially given the the scope of the equipment and the locations that they were given access to by the military, Days of Thunder was made on a budget that was 4 times that amount. And granted, it's kind of the same scenario where they were given access to, all of NASCAR's resources and, real cars and real drivers and real racetracks and so on and so on. And maybe, 4 years later, it accounts for some of that difference. But when you watch them, I feel like it's fairly surprising that Days of Thunder it costs so much more to make. Now, when you look at what they made on that budget, Top Gun on a $15 million budget turned in a profit of $357 million. I mean, even today, that's insane, especially adjusted for inflation. Days of Thunder made about $100 million on its budget, coming in at $158 million all told. Now, sure, that is nowhere near the smash, the devastating success that Top Gun was, but it's an absolute hit by any standard. Ultimately, it's probably not very surprising that both of these movies were successful, given that they featured a prime Tom Cruise controlling badass machines. That was tonight's Tale of the Tape.
All right, we're back with some scores. First up is Top Gun, and first up is also me, I suppose.
It is.
All right, here we go. Top Gun, visuals, 7. You mentioned they did a lot with a little, surprisingly little, and it's all there on screen. It's not so much special effects. There's not a lot of green screen happening or optical effects. Obviously, no CGI. This is practical. They got together with the military so they could strap cameras onto F-14 Tomcats and F-8 Hornets or whatever else they were using. They were on board the USS Enterprise. They were filming both specifically for the movie and also getting sort of like B-roll of the everyday goings on the ship to get a lot of like the show opens with ships coming in and land, or planes that is coming in and landing on the aircraft carrier. That's all on screen. It's shot well. Tony Scott has a very specific style that I like. I think somebody like a Michael Bay kind of took that and went the wrong way with it. Right. But I like what Tony Scott does with that approach. A lot of silhouettes and sunbeams and things like that. But the movie looks great. I give it a 7. It's well pulled off. Performance is 6.5. You mentioned earlier, I don't mean to steal your thunder, and you can elaborate on this. It's a well-casted movie. I'm not sure that any of the performances are actually super stand out. Everybody's doing a good job playing the character that they're meant to play, whether that be just nice or confident or cocky or an asshole or whatever you have.
The whole range.
To me, Tom Skerritt stands out in this movie. There's a specific scene, not to give spoilers for a movie that's, almost 40 years old, but there is a scene where he has a serious conversation with Tom Cruise, and I mentioned when we were talking, a lot of actors would have chosen to get quiet and whispery and growly. But his character is a very straightforward, regular person, even though he's this high-ranking military guy. And that's how he delivers the news. He just talks like a human being, which is something that is a little bit lacking in a lot of film and TV shows, people that act like humans.
Yeah.
And then for writing, I give it a 6.5. The Top Gun has a lot of weird things happening. At its core, it's essentially a personal drama. It's about a character dealing with grief and trauma and tragedy, etc. But then you also have shirtless volleyball scenes. So so it goes back and forth between like cheesy and corny that you'd expect out of something like this out of the 80s to actually having these more serious personal moments. I mentioned Tom Skerritt earlier. Tom Cruise does a great job with some of his stuff too, obviously. So there is a wide spectrum happening in this movie, but I think ultimately I come away giving it a 6.5 for the writing. So that's my board. Visual 7, performance is 6.5, writing 6.5. Claude, I turn to you.
I am not very far away from you.
Very simple.
We're going to start off with visuals, and I mean, I can't really expound much further, but it's an interesting movie to score visually because it's a military world first and foremost. They don't really do a lot that's not in a military environment of some kind. So even the costuming is, very specific.
Sure.
They get all that right, like they have the involvement of the Pentagon and access to whatever they want. Everybody looks great in uniform. You know, this is a movie with pretty people doing kind of real life things, but that are through a lens that is idealized, I guess. And it shows in the costuming, and obviously the flight scenes and all the aerial combat, especially for its day, are pulled off about as perfectly as you could hope for.
Mm-hmm.
It's easy to forget that these are like choreographed and arranged, and like the actors aren't doing the flying. Like you actually get lost into the story of it because it's so well pulled off, and I respect that. And it looks great. It's the visual style, the cinematography. I don't recall who Tony Scott uses, but since all his films kind of look the same, I don't know if it's because he uses the same DP or because he's so heavily involved. But as you said, it's a really visually appealing world with a very specific style. At this point, probably cliche a bit.
Sure.
But you don't get to that level without being almost iconic.
Yeah.
And I think that's what this is. It's a very 80s, very moody 80s world, very pristine, idealized, and all of that appeals to me. So 7.5. It's a high score for a movie that does not have overt special effects in it. Performances, it's a tough line to walk for performances because, like you said, I said, this movie is cast for the character. Is cast for how well the person pulls off that individual character. It's not cast necessarily for amazing acting prowess and legendary Oscar-winning skill. And I don't want to shit on the performances or the abilities of anybody in this movie because they're all, at minimum, very capable actors, and some of them are very good. It kind of just wants a very specific thing from each character, and they all do it beautifully. I rate it a 7 because everybody fits the character so well. And as you said in the intro, Matthew Modine was originally going to be Pete Mitchell, the Tom Cruise character. It's nothing against Matthew Modine, but I cannot picture that.
He was great in Full Metal Jacket.
There you go. I can't put him in here, so I mean it worked out.
Mm-hmm.
Moving on to the writing, it's the lowest scored category for me, just barely 6.5.
Mm.
There's not a lot of nuance in the writing of a movie like this. There's not a lot of texture, and the dialogue is kind of very basic. It's lampoonable in parts, but it accomplishes what it needs to. And the thing that kind of weighs a little heavier on my score for the writing in a movie like this is the amount of like memorable quotes and one-liners that you can get out of it. This movie has several. They stand the test of time for a reason. And again, almost become lampoonable, but it's because they stick in your brain so well and they leave their mark so strongly that you can kind of start to make fun of them and everybody knows what you're referencing.
Exactly.
And it's the mark of maybe not like, again, an award-winning film, but it's very well written and accomplishes something that it transcends, movie quality and becomes a part of pop culture.
Mm-hmm.
And this movie has absolutely done that, in my opinion. So here we are, 7.5, 7, 6.5. My scores for Top Gun.
So there we have it. One set of scores. When we come back, we'll have another. All right, we're back with a second set of scores, this time for Days of Thunder. And Claude, I believe you're up first.
Here we go. Not too dissimilar from Top Gun, but a little lower across the board. Starting with the visuals, 6.5. And there's not a lot of difference in, like again, we said it's the same director, same kind of visual style. But the visual effects it's the same type of approach where you're not looking at like special effects necessarily. It's a lot of filming of real world machinery and situations and objects, and again a larger body kind of donating the equipment and the cars and the things to the settings, the racetracks, the wardrobe, all of the above to kind of make the world believable, and it's legit. It's all the real stuff that you would see in real NASCAR. But I think some of the difference for me comes from the fact that Top Gun is it has the aerial component. It's a higher degree of difficulty and potential for disaster in some ways. Days of Thunder does all that, never leaves the ground. It's no less impressive in certain areas, perhaps a little bit less thrilling as a result. So, but I mean, again, all the hallmarks of a Tony Scott movie are still there visually, and it still has, it's 1990, so basically it's still the 80s. You still get
right.
all those satisfying elements visually that you did in Top Gun. So, visual 6.5 for me. Performances, actually, you're going to go a little higher. We agree off camera that across the board, maybe the caliber of actors is stronger in Days of Thunder, and the nuance and the level, I guess, of their performances is a little stronger in Days of Thunder as well. You have Robert Duvall, who for me sticks out as kind of the heaviest hitting character in the movie, and I think a lot of that is due to his strengths as an actor. It's more in Top Gun. The only real emotional journey is kind of Tom Cruise's character, and in this movie, it's spread around a little bit more. The stakes seem to affect more people in this movie. So, I mean, overall, there's a bit more nuance to the performances in Days of Thunder. So that explains the slightly higher score of 7.5. As far as the writing goes, I feel like it's weaker. It's similar. It's there's an argument to be made that Top Gun is a live-action cartoon in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
Especially in terms of some of the dialogue and the scenes and the script. This is less so. It's more real-world feeling, but it is also... There were scenes in it that struck me as being... You could almost hear the gears turning in the actors' heads. They were saying lines. And some of that, I think, is due to the nature of the dialogue they were saying. It came off a few times as though the actor just couldn't feel like it was organically something they lived. They were just kind of saying it to you. And I didn't notice as much of that in Top Gun. And maybe that is ultimately the biggest difference in the scores for me. And I don't really, as I mentioned with Top Gun, the importance of quotable lines and one-liners, I just don't come away with much of that from Days of Thunder. It's a very enjoyable movie overall, which I think when we tally up the scores, you'll see that. Mm-hmm. But 6, I think it's respectable. That's our cutoff for good on the show.
Sure.
And it hits that mark. So
okay.
6.5, 7.5, 6, Days of Thunder.
All right. Get out my board now. Flip it. Turn it. There you have it. Visuals 7. So very similar to Top Gun. I find them to be just about equal. Now you said it kind of loses the dimension, the 3 dimensions of aerial photography. You have the jets, but again, it's a very similar movie. It's a very similar approach in a different setting. So you're strapping cameras into and onto stock cars instead of fighter jets.
Right.
But they do a really good job. I mean, even again, these movies are so comparable. You mentioned the seamlessness with which they use footage, exterior shots of the ships flying around with the interior shots of the pilots and the co-pilots reacting and moving. As I mentioned, there is real race footage that doesn't include the cars that you see in the movie. There is real race footage where some of the race teams painted their cars to look like the cars in the movie. And there's stunt driving footage that didn't happen during regular races. Right. And there's the in-car shots of the drivers doing their thing with their black faces and helmets and goggles. And it's all brought together pretty seamlessly. So I think in that way it's very similar also to Top Gun.
Yep.
Overall, I feel like it gets... it accomplishes what it needs to accomplish just as successfully as Top Gun does. Visuals, I give a 7. For performances, I actually give a higher score for this movie. I give a 7. As you mentioned, there's a little bit more depth across more characters.
Yeah.
In Top Gun, again, you have Maverick going through some ups and downs, trials and tribulations. You also have Meg Ryan's character, but it's one scene of her being sad about what she's sad about. Again, avoiding spoilers for some reason for a movie that's almost 40. But most of the other characters are very one note across the board.
Yeah.
They're there to serve their purpose. In Days of Thunder, you have more characters that go through differing ups and downs. Robert Duvall's character experienced success. He has past trauma. He goes through sort of the ups and downs of Tom Cruise's character's challenges. Tom Cruise obviously goes through those challenges. Michael Rooker's character undergoes his own challenges. He comes off as sort of like what you would call the villain of the movie in the beginning, but then some things happen. He goes through some issues. His role is kind of not quite villainous.
Before you move on from him, I want to jump in.
Okay.
I forgot to say it when I was talking, so I'll just
Sure.
since you're on the character.
Yeah.
The thing about today was the first time I've seen Days of Thunder. So the thing that struck me about his character, and I think it is interesting, an interesting nuance I didn't factor into the writing that other movies I've seen haven't had, including Top Gun, where the antagonist kind of switches part of the way through the movie, and it reminded me very much of the Rocky and Apollo relationship.
Sure.
Especially as soon as they both get wheeled into the hospital.
Yeah.
I thought about that scene in Rocky 2 where he challenges them to fight right in the hospital and get up out of the chair. Sure enough, the next scene or two scenes, they have their own wheelchair confrontation.
That's so true. It's true. Actually, both of these movies do a good job with, in terms of a villain, Top Gun has like Soviet fighters, I guess, and there's kind of an action movie climax, but that's not really...
It's ambiguous.
It's not that important to the plot. The actual plot of the characters in the movie, again, talking about Top Gun, there's not really a villain.
Right.
The antagonist is the situation. It's very similar in Days of Thunder. Early in the movie, Roddy Burns kind of seems like a villain, but he's really not. And later in the movie, you have a character named Russ Wheeler, played by Cary Elwes. He kind of seems like a villain. But that could have been any race car driver. It didn't need to be. It was more about the situation and what the characters are going through. So both movies deserve credit for that, because it'd be very easy just to have a bad guy.
Right.
And have the whole movie be about the good guy versus the bad guy. And neither of these movies is really about that. So they both deserve credit for that.
That is a credit to both, considering how they both kind of have a reputation for being like kind of cardboardish, cookie cutter, populist movies.
Cliche 80s, 90s movies,
Yeah.
but really they're a little bit deeper than I think most people realize they are when you watch them.
Agreed.
Performances, but anyway, performances I give a 7, sort of more people doing a wider variety of things in this movie. Writing, 6, a little bit of a downgrade from Top Gun. Again, 6 is still kind of our cutoff for what's good in terms of how our scoring works. So I do think the movie's good. A lot of what we just talked about has to do with the writing.
Right.
Having a plot that could have just been about a guy who wants to win the big race. They go a little deeper than that. Same thing with Top Gun. They go a little deeper than just scaring away Russian fighter jets.
Yeah.
In this movie, again, you have multiple characters going through their own arcs. So the actors perform those well in terms of performances, but those were also written well in terms of the writing. There's also an element of Days of Thunder that gets a little bit of a downgrade. And again, I mentioned earlier in the intro when I was going over the basics that a lot of what happens in this movie to the character of Cole Trickle, played by Tom Cruise, is based on things that happened during the careers of two particular race car drivers, one named Tim Richmond, one named Jeff Bodine, as well as anecdotes that have happened in NASCAR over the years, and a lot of these are kind of all rolled into this character over the course of 108 minutes. In that way, the continuity of the narrative can kind of get a little loosey-goosey when all of a sudden you have kind of 7 pointless minutes of a silly situation with the crew eating ice cream, or some pretty lady dressed up as a cop kind of feeling him up as a joke,
Yeah, there were a couple of those moments that were kind of confusing.
Yeah, those scenes are fine, but they do kind of, deviate from the main drive of the plot. And I think maybe you had mentioned that it seems like a little bit of a longer movie, even though it's essentially the same length. I think it's things like that that maybe make the movie seem long, because when you're watching those scenes, they're fine, or they're clever, or they're witty, or they're fun, or they're harmless, but they steer you away from the main plot, and so it kind of creates maybe a little bit of a dead zone and sort of the forward momentum of the story.
I think you're right. I hadn't considered that.
Yeah, so a little bit of a downgrade for that, but still, I come away with a 6 for writing. Both of these movies are solid, and both of them, I think, are more than what their reputation would have you believe, which is that they're just dumb action 80s movies. And
Right.
I think that they do have a little bit more than that going for them. So, visuals 7, performances 7, writing 6. We are going to step away for a moment, do some tabulations, and be back with the big board. As I said, we are now back with the big board. We have done some final tabulations, and we have what amounts to our closest one-on-one battle in the history of the show so far. Top Gun taking the win, 6.83 against a score of 6.66 for Days of Thunder. Claude, any thoughts about what we see here?
Going into this, we kind of took into account the common assessment of these movies, that they are essentially the same movie with different subject matter.
Sure.
I think, given our thoughts about each movie, we've kind of shot some holes in that perception, but at the same time, scoring-wise, we're kind of proving that right. I mean, it's close. And if you look at these movies surface level, I think it would have been surprising if we didn't have this close of a matchup between them. And also, I feel that this reflects my personal feelings, that I enjoyed Top Gun just a little more. And then the score is just a little higher.
Yeah, my scores I think ended up being exactly the same when you did the math. So, your slightly higher score for Top Gun ultimately made the difference. I think that, again, yes, like you said, this is not surprising at all. These movies are very similar. They have similar plot structures, similar characters. They do have differences, which I think we did a good job of illustrating. In terms of the final score, I think, again, not surprising. I think in terms of the legacy of these movies, Top Gun is definitely more, well, I guess I should say Days of Thunder is more of a niche thing.
Right.
I think that both of these movies can get sort of eye rolls, as we said before, as sort of like cliched 80s action movies or whatever. I think Days of Thunder can suffer even more under sort of the cliche of like, well, it's a racing movie, it's about NASCAR, something that hicks and rednecks watch. I grew up in a home where there was a lot of racing on over the years, and at different points in my childhood, I knew a lot about the drivers and what their cars looked like and what their number was and what their sponsors were. I had a favorite driver, the whole 9 yards. I haven't watched racing in a long time. But you do not have to watch racing. You do not have to be a racing fan to enjoy Days of Thunder.
No.
It stands on its own, and I think that if most people gave it an honest watch, it would surprise them.
Yeah, I was actually surprised myself by Days of Thunder in particular. It is a very pigeonholed subject matter, as you said, with a certain demographic of people and region of people.
Sure.
But it does a very good job of covering that region and hitting all those points that are associated with NASCAR, without ever feeling like it's all just like Southern hillbillies or anything like that. It's a very, like you said, it appeals. It's mass appealing to all walks of life.
Yeah. So there you have it. Again, just to go over it again, Top Gun with a very tight, very small margin of victory, 6.83 to 6.66 for Days of Thunder. All right, I guess that's it for this episode of Nerd Bomber versus Movies. We are here on YouTube. Obviously, you have already found us. We also have a podcast, the Nerd Bomber Podcast, that can be found on Instagram at Nerd Bomber Pod. Instagram is the best place to find us. That is, you can also find links to our personal pages and the various things that we do. With that said, I am just Jamie.
I'm your friend Claude.
And until the next battle,
Aloha.
Please deposit litter in trash receptacles as you exit the auditorium. The perfect gift for any occasion, gift certificates are available at the box office. Thanks for visiting with us. Buckle up and drive safely. See you next week.